So the source to do with the Man from the Bronx by the New York Times is in the context of the Miranda ruling, in which the Supreme Court found that Miranda, who was a man accused of murder and who had confessed, could not be the confession could not be used because Miranda was not informed of his right to counsel or his right to against self-incrimination. And so this is a case that occurred in the Bronx in sort of the wake of Miranda, in which the uh, the defendant was not Mirandized by the police, presumably because this was sort of a recent ruling, and as a result, he gets off. Um, and the New York Times piece is sort of an observation of that fact of the case, and it doesn't really make an argument per se. Um, some things can be made of the choices of imagery, like the description of the courtroom scene in the first half is very much evocative of this sort of feeling of embarrassment. There's this description of blushing. The judge comes out and says that he is, regretfully handing down his decision, but he's bound and constrained by the law. Um, and there's this description of the defendant shambling out of the courtroom, which, all this strong visual imagery, which, along with the evocative headline, sort of lends itself to this outraged response to this case. But sort of in the second half, there is a sort of tone shift in which the article refers to the idea that that all the supporting evidence in this case really was just this confession, and it talks to the lawyer of the defendant, who makes the argument that sort of in the aggregate this isn't that big a deal, and so because the New York Times is a professional newspaper and that this is a piece of professional, journalism, there is an attempt to remain objective and provide not an argument but an observation, and sort of the reader, depending on their personal proclivities, can read into either the first half or the second half of the article. I think it is interesting that they chose not to include any statement by the victim or by the prosecuting attorney. I think you could maybe construe that as bias, but the they already included a statement by the judge, who's obviously sympathetic to the victim, and the that element in and of itself, I don't think is representative of some deeper bias. The language used obviously is, something that's not very high level. This article is not dealing with the legal concepts at play, or it doesn't really go into that. It just explains the situation, but in a way that doesn't necessarily take a hard stance. For example, the defendant is never called a rapist. The events are all alleged, but despite that language, despite that wording, the way that the first couple of paragraphs are phrased, it's pretty obvious that the New York Times is not making any contention that this man is not guilty, but that he did do it, the crime that he's accused of. And so the historical sort of significance of this is that, well, first of all, there were a slew of similar events in the wake of Miranda that sort of guilty people did get off as a result. People that would have been found guilty pre-Miranda did get off as a result of Miranda. And that, this has some moral significance on the ruling. The idea that the rights of the accused are more important than the um, than getting every guilty person is something that's obviously the core of the Miranda ruling, and the the sort of negative side of that, the fact that sometimes people who are obviously guilty will get off as a result of Miranda, is why this particular news story about a case is relevant to think about, because it's very easy to say, well, better that one um, innocent person goes free than 10 guilty people, when you don't have a case staring you in the face where an elderly lady who's been raped, her perpetrator gets off. So,